Prejudice and discrimination have weaved throughout our country's history. But what about in North Dakota? KX News brings together community and government leaders to discuss those questions and more. Tonight, a KX News Town Hall, Race in the Dakotas. Now, here are your hosts, Nicholas Kwolek and Lauren Culver.
Thanks for joining us tonight as we host a special KX News Town Hall on race in the Dakotas. I'm Nicholas Kwolek.
And I'm Lauren Culver. This summer has brought intense discussions on racism and discrimination, and North Dakota has been a part of that discussion. So for the next half hour, we'll hear from leaders from all around North Dakota on ways we can all find common ground.
Tonight, we're joined by Joseph McNeil Jr. with the Standing Rock Development Corp., Ruth Buffalo, a state representative from Fargo, Dan Donlin, the retired chief of the Bismarck Police Department, and Ernest Usher, a community advocate in Minot. Thank you all for being here.
And Ernest, we are going to begin with you. Since the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis back in May, we have seen protests all over the country, including right here in North Dakota. Your group, For the People, helped organize a Black Lives Matter protest and vigil for George Floyd in Minot. How do you think that event affected the city?
Changed everything. Before that, the city they were a place where nobody really talked about some of these diversity issues, racial issues. They were just, I guess you can use the word sleep. But after the George Floyd Memorial that we were able to put on and bring awareness to the city, things changed. People began to ask questions. They began to look for literature in, downtown bookstores and in libraries. They began to wake up and realize that the rest of the country, of what they were feeling, it can be felt right there in Minot. So a lot of things have changed since then, a lot.
Pretty proud of the event?
I am absolutely proud of the event, the people that put on the event, and the people that came to the event. We had over 300 people, and we only expected 50. And they didn't come just to come. They came with some kind of solution in mind, some kind of question to say, what can we do to make sure not that that situation doesn't happen here, but what can we do to make sure we're a better community? And that's what we began to just build upon since that time.
Thank you.
Joe, your father was one of 4 men to peacefully protest racism in Greensboro, North Carolina, when he refused to give up his seat at a whites-only lunch counter back in 1960. And I believe that's your father on the left there, is that correct?
Yeah, the far left.
Far left. Mm-hmm. That obviously helped spark a lot of change. What is your perspective on those protests, and is the world making a change?
When we look back at the sit-in movement back February 1st, 1960, where it really began for my father was being treated less than human. And for him, it was a move to get his humanity back, to gain his humanity back. And the same thing for the 3 other comrades that joined him. And during that particular action, they had to make sure and be smart that when they did that action, that they did it in a way that was going to get traction, that wasn't going to be violent. Because when things are termed or seen or portrayed or relayed as this is a violent action, then it's dismissed. So he was very smart about doing this action in a nonviolent way, first of all, but tactful in the selection of where they were going to do it, being a Woolworths that didn't serve people of color at the counter. They had to be served in the back. They were by policy. So they established themselves as customers first. And then when they were told that they're not going to be served here, they put their receipts out and they said, "We are customers already here. How do you mean you don't serve us?" So they sat at that counter. When the police came, they weren't violent. They weren't aggressive. They sat quiet, peacefully during that time. So the officer couldn't do anything because they weren't disturbing anybody. They weren't being served. They were sitting there. And they also did this towards the end of the day. So it wasn't a long time where people could rally up a bunch of other folks to come and pull them out of the seats, because at that time, this was Jim Crow. They could have been pulled out of those seats, drugged down into the corner, and murdered, lynched, and the laws wouldn't have protected them then. So they were very tactful about how they did it, and they needed to cause disruption. So when we're looking at what they did back then as disrupting a system of policy that was ingrained in society, they had to disrupt the system. They couldn't let things be casual, or this is normal, or we're going to make people feel comfortable and safe.
Right.
Their presence at that lunch counter made people question, oh, that's not supposed to be. Those boys aren't supposed to be there. What are they doing there? What followed subsequent to that was what happens at every change in this country, for the most part, is that disruptive action, consistent, peaceful, disruptive action, causes an economic shift. And those economic shifts change policy, because when you start affecting the money is when people start thinking that they need to make a change.
Inspire change.
And that's unfortunately the way it goes. It's not that a person's human rights have been trampled on, or a person's humanity or their value is being recognized. It is coming down to commerce. So we look at what's happened then, and we look at what's happening now. What happened to George Floyd was horrifying. I couldn't watch more than half of it because I knew what was happening in him, and I've seen it before, and it's happened to my relatives. So the actions that occurred after that, and it spread all over the country. When there was a march in Minot, there was a march in Fargo, and there was a march in Bismarck, I was shocked that there was a march in Bismarck. I didn't think that that was going to happen here, and it did. We rushed to get into it, you know, towards the tail end of it.
And this is going to bring us into my question for Dan. You served Bismarck as a police officer, 30 years, many years as the police chief. Since George Floyd's death, policies, practices, they've come under more scrutiny. Do you think there is a need for police reform in North Dakota?
Yeah, in North Dakota, you know, I think in one sense we're very blessed in this community for being more rural. We try to, I can speak from the Bismarck Police Department where I served 30 years from there. I don't know if it's reform or if it's to ensure that we have those policies and practices in place and that training is there. And that's where I think we need to have is more of a intense focus on officer training. Got to remember, these are human beings, just like you and me, and then they're put out there, and in today's day and age and what's going on, I mean, imagine having somebody in your face and not moving and that finger up to your nose and invading your personal space, and you sit there and just have to take it, you know. They're going through some tough times now as well. Training, I think, is very important, and by that aspect, what I mean is, you know, when budgets get cut, training's the first thing to go. Most departments are training at the minimal standards to make sure all their officers stay certified. We need to put that focus, more emphasis on use of force training, and not just a review of policy, you know, reading a policy every year. It's actual scenario-based, hands-on use of force training, so you get that read, because under stress, you go back to the training that you conducted. And the other aspect of training that I think is very important, given what we're going through in this world today and in North Dakota, is we need more cultural diversity training. I know as the chief, I looked out to try to get some cultural diversity training in based on many race, cultures, and backgrounds, and it's hard to find. It is really hard to find and come in. We can have individuals like yourselves come in and talk about your experience growing up, but we need to tie that into the human heart and the human attitude so those officers understand. They do a good job. It's a lot of times, and what I always taught was, you know, you give respect, you get respect, and then try to stay above people that are really trying to goat you or get you to react, and stay professional. But that's where I think we need to focus, is training. Community policing, a huge issue, is getting out into the neighborhoods, getting out into the community, and making all neighborhoods and individuals part of the police department and the community and what the solutions are for community issues. And I think that's where focus needs to be put on.
Certainly, a lot of perspective. Representative Buffalo, we will get to you. Still ahead in our town hall, candid discussion of what it means to be Black or Native American in North Dakota in 2020 and whether stereotypes are a problem. Stay with us. And welcome back. We're going to turn now to Representative Buffalo. We're a few months away from the next legislative session. Do the last few months have you considering introducing any legislation regarding matters of race?
Thank you for the question. You know, there's a young MHA woman running for state senate in California, and she said something very, very poignant recently. She stated that we're not going to be able to legislate our way out of racism. And I really believe that was a powerful statement. I believe that the change that we need is going to happen at the community level, organically through the grassroots movement. And you know, in 2017, a group of us introduced legislation focusing on cultural competency. It died by 6 votes in the Senate, and at the time, the only Native American serving in the state legislature at the time, Senator Richard Marcelez of Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, was able to carry this legislation forward for us. So we're very thankful for him championing this. But you know, cultural competency, it's not the be-all, end-all, but we felt at that point in time we had to do something as community members. And so we introduced this legislation that would have required lawmakers to take 4 hours of cultural competency training at the beginning of the legislative session. And it wasn't solely focused on American Indians, it was focused on all people, all backgrounds, races, religions, sexual orientation. And so it didn't win, you know, in the becoming a law, but it still was a small win in that we had this conversation in the halls of the legislature. So much of our true history of North Dakota is not included in K through 12 curriculum. And we know that education starts within the home or within a household. But if it's not being taught in the household or the home, there's an opportunity to receive this education in the K through 12 institutions. But and then it is harmful if our lawmakers do not have a good understanding of other cultures outside of their own. Hence the action that we took as community members back in 2017. But again, you know, you don't need to be a lawmaker to make change. It happens at the community level. And so these are much needed conversations that we do need to have. It is an existing issue. There is potential to improve the quality of life through the policies that we do enact at the state legislative level, but I believe that the change is really going to happen at the community level. That's the heart of where matters are, and it should really drive policy. But I am looking into hate crime legislation potentially because what's written in North Dakota Century Code really doesn't address the issues that we're seeing on the ground. And so we do need to take a proactive approach and try to get to the root causes of issues, and part of that is education. If we continue to ignore the true history of these lands, which are the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation that we stand on currently, history will unfortunately repeat itself in different facets. So it's good to always look at things with a comprehensive lens and try to center the voices that are closest to the pain.
Thank you so much. Ernest, you've had the chance to have discussions with law enforcement leaders to talk about improving relationships between police and people of color. What are you pushing for?
I like what Khan already spoke about in regards to the training that they're doing. That's one thing that I am pushing for, what he was speaking of, making sure the training is correct. So when someone, you know, has to have a relationship with the law, it's not always when it's blue and red behind them. That's the only time you get to know the law. We expect that the law enforcement get involved with the community, and I push for that. I'm a very good friend with one of the PD there. We're like really close. We talk all the time since the George Floyd Memorial. And one thing he always bounces off me is, what else can we do? What event can we have? What can we sit down and do? Can we come to you all's community event as well? Because we want to get in contact with the community. And he does that. And I expect that to happen because, as the representative was stating, if you don't understand the culture of people, you don't understand the reaction they may have when the cop does show up. Or it may be something that's simple and small that the cops aren't needed. It's simply someone of a social worker might be needed, or a psychiatrist might be needed. But the cops can't be the only ones doing these things, trying to be the law, the psychologist, trying to be everything, and it's frantic for them. So what we're trying to push, make sure in Minot, the right people show up to do the right job when people are going through a crisis, because these people are hurt. You just can't throw everybody in jail that may have a drug addiction. They feel pain too. And so we need someone that will help them through that pain and not a cop that's just going to just throw them away and lock them up. And that's what we're pushing to make sure the cops understand that. And most of them are wrapping their head around, okay, when we go to a call, it's not going to automatically be solution-based where we're going in, guns blazing, we're going to see what's going on, and we're going to lock it down. They're going in asking questions now. They're going in asking and concerned about the individual and not so much concerned about the final solution. And that's what we've been pushing.
Dan, let's talk about the idea of implicit bias. That is the idea that all of us unconsciously make assumptions about other people based on stereotypes. Do you think this is an issue in North Dakota? And should local police be trained to confront implicit bias, in your opinion?
We all as individuals, and then therefore especially with police officers, that's something I know at the Bismarck Police Department we do bring up. I don't know everything about cultural backgrounds we need to learn, but there are differences in the way different cultures may react to police, especially new immigrants coming across where they're used to the military or their police being very violent, and then they're very fearful of police if they come to America. So it's important, as Ernest said, is the police need to be out there, the public needs to be open to those relationship building opportunities, because that's where the foundation of trust is built off of relationships, not strangers. The implicit bias, I think we all kind of carry that, consciously or subconsciously, and I don't necessarily mean it has to be about race either. This can be implicit bias of the community towards police, good or bad. Addiction issues, there's implicit bias to people with addiction. Why don't they just stop? Why don't they stop drinking? Domestic violence, why doesn't she just leave? There's so many built up dynamics that have been going on for a long time that are difficult and it takes time to get into, not the 20 minutes the police are on scene. So it's about training the officers, being aware of differences in culture, in their outlook on law enforcement, down to the individual who may have had 3 or 4 bad contacts because they violated the law, and then you have an individual that, although they got arrested, their contacts turned out good. And what it boils down to is those relationships and mutual respect amongst people.
Okay. Excellent points. Thank you for your feedback. We're going to be back in just a few minutes with more from our guests. Welcome back, and we're going to begin with Ruth Buffalo, representative. Is there a misconception you think people should know about when it comes to Native Americans?
Yes, there's misconceptions of Native Americans. I grew up hearing drunk Indian jokes, dumb Indian jokes. There's a misconception that we're lazy, that we live off of the government, and so we have, so many educated Native Americans today. There was a study that came out recently, I would say within the past 5 years, of the Dakotas showing that Native Americans had a higher rate of sobriety than white people. And so, interestingly enough, that misconception has been popping up across North Dakota for some reason recently, even by professionals and people who work with our incarcerated relatives. So it's concerning to see that in this day and age, these misperceptions are still alive and well today. And so we have a lot of work to do. We have an opportunity to help educate others, but by default, I think the average Native American person, all of us by default have this extra role as an educator, because our true history is not taught in the history books, K through 12 curriculum, the accurate true history of our land. And so education is an opportunity to help bring healing, help bring better understanding. Right. We can't put that enormous pressure on somebody to learn everything about a culture outside of their own. So I know that cultural competency is even an outdated term. We're forever evolving, and so cultural responsiveness training is kind of more meet halfway in the middle to learn about each other. But yes, these misperceptions of Native Americans are pretty harmful, and we saw a lot of that surface, in 2016, and even just recently today. And so, our children are watching, and we have to do better.
Joe and then Ernest, please. Misconceptions about black people.
Well, I come from both. My mother's Hunkpapa Lakota from Little Eagle, South Dakota, just south of Fort Yates there, and then my father, is black from Wilmington, North Carolina. And I can echo a lot of what Ruth is saying, because on one end, for one half of my life, I've been at home on Standing Rock. I've served for tribal council, and we ever have this discussion, you serve educator, advocate, to take away or to diminish, not just to diminish, but to outright say that these things that are considered stereotypical facts of Native Americans aren't true. That doesn't happen in my family, it doesn't happen in most of the community that I live. But when you look at the trauma that people endure,
Right.
there is a certain characteristic that it's always focused upon by society at large, by white society, to say that that is a fault of your race. You can't handle this, you can't do that. But the history of extermination and termination of our people, one side of my life, is there and apparent, and that goes back to the history and the truth of what really needs to be discussed about how these lands came to be, how we came to be on reservations. On the other side is how do we become redlined and oppressed? That goes back to plantations and being treated as property and chattel slavery, and being redlined and then forced into economic situations that are very difficult and not allowed to expand out of that. So when you look at the communities on the black side of my life that touch me, look at Rosewood, look at Wilmington, North Carolina, those communities that did come up, black communities that did come up, were destroyed, were massacred. These people were massacred.
I'd like to get through all of you. Ernest, your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely, that we're loud, that we're obnoxious, that we're not educated, that we live off of the government, that we never will amount to anything, that people are tired of us always dancing and making all this music. Any of those stereotypes are always taught us that we're lazy, but our backs built the country through slavery. How can we be lazy? How can we were whooped, we were beaten, all these things happened to us, and we're supposed to just get over it in 1865 when we were given our freedom, but we're not given any equity, we haven't been given any money, we haven't been given any reparations. We're supposed to just move on in the country as if nothing happened, while those that built off of our backs live in lavish places and have equity. So yeah, absolutely, those things we're tired of, and that's why my wife and I, we are allowed to do this program we have called Be the Bridge, that through our church we actually have it at our house where we're teaching people through the church about eliminating racial disparities.
Thank you so much. Dan, can you answer in 20 seconds? Misconceptions about police.
Misconceptions about police, that they are out there to just harass people. They're paid harassers, especially if they can find somebody of color or a different race or something. They are out there trying to keep their communities safe, keep themselves and others safe. They're out there to enforce the law, and they usually get called to these types of incidents.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here today.
And thank you for joining us for tonight's town hall event.
We'll see you tonight on KX News at 9 on the Dakota CW.